In recent sessions of the chat, we've talked about affordable housing, reproductive rights, major developments in the city's working waterfront, immigration and essential workers. But this issue, I think, in addition to affecting us nationwide, is dividing small communities and even families. And it's the bitterness of our polarized politics. So we've got two political experts here, really. Our guest, Shannon Jenkins, and our host, who's a columnist and longtime political reporter, Jack Spillane. So Jack, I'll let you take it from here and introduce Shannon.
Thanks, Andy, and welcome, Dr. Jenkins, who I've known for a long time. We're here to talk about negative partisanship, as Dr. Jenkins, or Shannon, as I always called her, tells me. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah. So, Shannon, I just want to start by giving people a little of your background, because not everybody may know your qualifications as well as I do. You're the Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at UMass Dartmouth and a professor in the Department of Political Science, where you served as the chair of the Political Science Department from 2012 to 2018. Your primary research focuses on decision-making in state legislatures with a specific focus on the role of political organizations and gender in shaping outputs in these institutions. You've also researched the effects of engaged learning pedagogies on college students' political interest and engagement. You were awarded the Manning Prize for Teaching Excellence in 2019, and you're the co-author of 3 books and have received 2 Fulbright Awards in China. You received your PhD in political science from Loyola University in Chicago. So we'll get that out of the way to convince people that you are indeed qualified to be talking on this subject. Shannon, you have all these qualifications, but unfortunately, you may be best known to South Coast readers because you were involved in this controversy over the use of the name Indians and the logo in the Dartmouth school system. So I think of that as a good metaphor for what's going on in the country. Do you think what happened with that controversy is a reflection of this negative partisanship in terms of the political and cultural divisions that are dividing the country?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, I don't want to sort of relitigate the debate about what, the mascot or what the logo or what we should do about it. Clearly that decision has been made. We've moved on, right? But I think, yeah, some of the divisions that occurred are a reflection of what we see nationwide. And it's part, right, that political scientists, when we talk about partisanship, we talked about what we might call cognitive and affective dimensions of partisanship. Cognitive is the rational issue-based partisanship, and the affective dimension of partisanship is that emotional partisanship. And affective partisanship has always been sort of the predominant strain of partisanship in the US. But until recently, it was a very positive sort of attachment to parties, right? People were Democrats or Republicans because they liked the Democratic or the Republican Party. Increasingly, starting a little before 2016, but we really saw this very clearly emerge in the 2016 election, that people are driven more by dislike of the other side than they are by like or attachment to their own side. And so when you're driven by dislike for people who have opposing views from you, it tends to ratchet things up, right? That person is not just someone with whom you disagree, but they become the embodiment of all that is bad or not good. And winning becomes very sort of emotional and high stakes. And so we saw that a lot in this debate in the town about the logo. And people on both sides were very charged and upset and angry about the issues at hand. And that makes it difficult when you're that emotional, right, to sort of take a step back and maybe think about things rationally. And so we see that on a lot of issues, right, where people are talking past each other as opposed to talking to each other. The things that people say to each other can be hurtful and negative. And then I'll say, it wasn't just in the logo issue. We've seen this on school committees across the country during the pandemic. that school committee members who are by and large, from my experience, right, people who are just trying to do the best and volunteering their time for the town, were subject to like some really ugly stuff. And that's troubling, particularly for me, because I think engaging in politics is important. But it turns a lot of people off from that engagement. They become alienated and disengaged and disinclined to participate. And I think that's not what we need in our politics right now.
Has there been research yet? You say this really got going around 2016, when of course Donald Trump ran for president. Has there been research as to how this personalization of political differences really got going?
It's hard to sort of unpack, to go back in that moment in time, right, when this really starts to emerge, because people are sort of bad witnesses about, right, their thought processes. But we can look at sort of, you know, the things that are going on in people's lives and the way people approach politics. And so we see things, right? We talk a little bit about in political science too, geographic sorting, right? That we start to see in, you know, the 2000s, that people start to sort where they live, right? Based on, or I guess I should say starts to correlate fairly highly with politics. So people who see themselves as Democrat want to live in different kind of places than people who see themselves as Republicans. And so then we start to see, right, these, well, all the people that I'm with are talking to, right, we create bubbles, right, because our neighbors are all think like us. They're either all Republicans or they're all Democrats. And so that sort of intermingling is less likely to occur. Robert Putnam, who's up at Harvard, had a great sort of classic work on this called Bowling Alone, right? And part of his argument is, right, you know, back in the 50s and 60s, everyone would go to bowling leagues and you'd meet different people from all walks of life and everyone was bowling together. But we don't do that anymore, right? And he wrote the book, I think, in the early 2000s. It's become even more true now, right? That social connectedness and that social capital that comes from socializing with people who are not like us is declining. And we're sorting ourselves into narrower and narrower bubbles. Liliana Mason and Nathan Kalmo have a good book looking at this, and particularly Liliana Mason argues, I think pretty effectively, that partisanship has come over the last decade to be our defining identity for many people, right? So everything becomes wrapped around partisanship. It used to be you thought of yourself from where you live. But now, right, the media you consume, the TV shows you watch, the sorts of places you shop, all of those things start to correlate with partisanship, right, such that our partisan identities start to become predominant, and they're driven by this negative affect. So you see just sort of a polarization occur. And it's really troubling. I mean, the first time I sort of heard about all this and we started talking about it was after the 2016 election. In political science, we have a conference called the State of the Parties. And it's people studying, you know, partisanship in the electorate, parties and legislatures, party organizations. We go and we talk about our research and what we saw in the election. And someone showed, we do every 2 years a national election study, and they ask people, they have feeling thermometers, like, how do you feel about this candidate or that candidate or this person or that person? And the negatives for both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were through the roof, levels we had never seen before. And that negative partisanship, how you felt about the opposing candidate, was the strongest predictor of how you voted. So if you dislike Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, there weren't many of those people, we couldn't tell who you voted for. But if you dislike Hillary Clinton more than you dislike Donald Trump, we know who you voted for, right? And so it's increasingly people's identity and behavior are driven by this negative attachment to the other, a negative feeling about the other side of the partisan aisle.
How big a role has the media played in this, specifically social media and talk radio, cable television news? I'm sad to say, because I spent my life in community journalism, there's fewer and fewer newspapers to have influence. But how big a role has the media played in this
Well, and that's, I think, part of the reason why I was so depressed leaving that conference is the other thing that we know from political science research is that while people claim to hate negative news stories about politics, negative political advertisement, when you ask people down the road what they remember, they don't remember any of the positive stuff. They remember all the negative stuff. And so it's this reinforcing spiral, right? That if the media tries to run stories that are positive and in depth, fewer people engage. If you run negative stories, people engage. And we know the news media is struggling, right? It is struggling. And so can you choose to go the higher road and have declining readership? Or do you have to go with, if it bleeds, it leads, right? And so I think there's some negative sort of reinforcement going on there. There's also a lot of research that suggests, right, the decline of local media has been bad for politics. It leads to less accountability, more corruption, more problems. And then, right, again, we get into that spiral. So it's both. I will also say, I think that social media does play a big role. Maybe not in the way that we think it does. I think some of the research that I've seen suggests that it's not that there are more negative people in politics. I mean, it may seem that way, and it is a little bit, but social media makes it easier for those people to express views, right? So if you think about, I'll say back in the day, Jack, when you got started, right? If you wanted to, so you had to, sit down, handwrite a letter, right? Type it out, get a stamp, right? Put it in the mailbox. You had to do all that work.
Go to the library to research something.
Right. You had to do a lot of work to be able to do that. But you don't anymore, right? You can just dash off a thought in the heat of the moment. You don't have to think about it. It's very low cost. You have a phone right at your hand. You type it up in 2 seconds and it's done. And so it's lowered the costs, right? Which I think originally people thought would be good, but I think it's not necessarily good. And it tends to amplify, right, the most negative of voices. And so that's a problem. And I'm not sure how we fix that, right? That was when I left that conference. I was like, I can see the problem. I think we can all see the problem, but the fix is not entirely clear. Yeah. How do you change that? Where do you intervene? What do you do?
I wonder a lot because I am in the media. Traditionally, the media played a gatekeeper role to information. So if it was libelous or if it was no basis in fact, we just didn't include it in our stories. I mean, sometimes we made a mistake and things got through, but generally we didn't include, just things that were based on rumor in our stories. But social media has no such vetting. And it seems to me that there's a lot of people who have trouble distinguishing between factual information and non-factual information.
Yeah, well, let me elaborate on something else and then get back to the misinformation. I will say, I think it's also hard, right? We know that local media in particular, but media in general, has had budgets cut and personnel cut. And so it's harder to investigate the information that you get, right? So if there's a claim made, right, and you have to investigate, well, is this true or not? You might ask two people, we call it both sidesing it. You get one side from the Democrats, one side from the Republicans, you print both quotes and then you go, because you have to move on because you have so few people covering what's going on. And so there's also, I would say, less ability, and I don't blame reporters for this, right? But there's less ability to sort of evaluate the information that's coming to you, right? Because there's so few of you, right? People used to spend days working on a story. I don't think many reporters have the luxury of doing that anymore, right? You phone a couple sources, you get a couple quotes, and you move on. I think the other thing that's problematic is we've become really polarized in our consumption of the media, right? And so the sources of information that people rely on are very different, right? And they report things differently, right? And so there is a lot of misinformation out there, and people have a hard time distinguishing, right, what's information and what's not. You know, the purveyors of misinformation are sophisticated, right? They use multiple channels and multiple strategies to purvey misinformation. And again, there's research showing that if you saturate someone's environment with enough misinformation, they lose the ability to sort of, right, distinguish what's real and what's not real. Like, how do you change that? I don't know, right? It's a super complicated problem that I'm not sure what the cure is for that problem.
Has this arisen from just the growth in, I mean, there's a million cable channels, you know, well, not a million, but lots and lots of cable channels, lots and lots of social media. Talk radio is still with us. Fewer and fewer newspapers. Is it a function of, well, these are the sources people have, and you know, maybe they're partisan, maybe they're pressed for time, and not, you know, it was. I have to just remark that it really is a revelation that just because you talk to a Democrat and a Republican doesn't mean you got to the true story, because
Right.
one side or the other, or, you know, or both, are often misleading you, and so a meaningful story doesn't mean I talk to both sides. It's not as simple as that.
Right. And that's, I mean, but it's a challenge, right? If you've got 10 stories in 8 hours in the day, right, you don't have time to investigate the claims of, you know, that people are giving you. And that is a problem. You know, I think a lot of these things all start to build on each other too. When you have the local media landscape is fairly decimated. So people look to social media, right, for information, for news. And how do you stand out? How do you get retweeted? How do you get liked, right? Well, it's not saying the same old thing that everyone else is saying, right? It's pushing the envelope. And when you push and you push and you push, all of a sudden the envelope's, right, you know, way out here. And so things, right, that are, you know, that used to, you know, be sort of unheard of in politics are just commonplace, right? And I can't help but think about my husband was out the other day and he saw, I think he was at the Cumberland Farms in New Bedford, right? And go to a regular place, and he saw a guy drive up with not even a Let's Go Brandon flag, right? It just had the Joe Biden, right? Like, I couldn't help but think somebody's riding in their car with their 6 or 7-year-old who's learning to read, right? Who sees that and who reads that. And at what point in time, I mean, I don't have a problem. I'm not a prude, right? With people saying these things in the privacy of their home to their friends, whatever. But driving around with that on your car, right? When did that become acceptable? But we keep the limits of what becomes acceptable, keep getting pushed out. And I don't know how we push them back in, right?
You know, it's funny, people, whether it's algorithms that push these extreme, the most controversial things on social media, or ratings or readership numbers that drive newspapers and television and radio, there is, you can't, the public wants to pay attention to what the public wants to pay attention to. And even though in surveys they'll say, I don't want controversy, I don't want scandal, their actual habits, because we can trace now what they're clicking on, you know, what they're looking at, and their actual habits are not exactly what they say they want. So, I mean, in all honesty, the Dartmouth Indian controversy was a minor, well, not a minor thing. I think it was an important thing for the town, but it certainly wasn't more important than the state of education overall, the state of healthcare, and, you know, the land conservation, any number of issues in the town, taxes, and yet it certainly got more ink than any other issue in the last year. So, is there the problem of, you know, there's no accounting for taste, there's no accounting for what people want?
Yeah, well, you know, this is where my colleagues, the psychologists, would come in, right? And we have sort of the rational side where we say, you know, we want things and we want to do things. But, you know, the way we process information is just not we don't approach sort of our ideal, right? And so, thinking about misinformation or false beliefs, right? We used to think, well, if someone believes something that was fake, we just need to give them more information, because more information will counter the false information, right? But people really don't like cognitive dissonance, right? It's when things in your mind don't agree, right? They don't align. People do not like that. Our brains at a fundamental level do not like cognitive dissonance. And so we will do whatever we can to sort of make that cognitive dissonance go away, right? Almost at a subconscious level. And so once information or beliefs get in, it's very hard to change those beliefs. Research also shows that we're really bad at when we try to change beliefs, we're really bad at trying to do this. And this is part of the problem in our politics and our debate. So I always love the story of this study. They went, Jonathan Haidt, some people just like or dislike Jonathan Haidt, but he has what he calls moral foundations theory. And he talks about how there's like sort of 5 different sort of critical values: equality, freedom, in-group loyalty, respect for authority, and I can't remember, distaste, I think, is the 5th. And he argues that liberals really focus on sort of 2 of those, which are equality and freedom, whereas for conservatives, all 5 of those are important. And so what happens is that liberals tend to argue on those 2 channels, and Republicans argue across all 5 channels. Not better or worse, just different, right? And so they're talking past each other. So as an example, someone did an experiment, this is a while back, about gay marriage, right? And they presented arguments. They asked liberals and conservatives what their values were about gay marriage prior to doing the experiment. And then they looked to see if they could change their opinions. And in the first sort of round, they talked about how gay Americans are, they should be treated equally. They should be free to, marry whomever they want. It didn't change anyone's views about gay marriage, right? This was in the 2000s. But then they changed the issue. And they talked about, they framed the issue in sort of values that are important to conservatives, that gay Americans are Americans, just like everyone else. And they deserve, as tax-paying, loyal Americans, to have the same rights. That sort of argument was effective in changing conservatives' minds. They did the flip side for military spending, right? They asked, right, should we increase military spending? Didn't change opinions in a general sort of way. But when you framed it as the military is a path to the middle class and to a more equal life for many Americans, it led to increased support for spending among liberals. The funny thing is even after the researchers told people that this is what you need to do to persuade someone if you disagree, you talk from their beliefs, not from your own beliefs. We're really bad at it. Like only 10% of the people could frame an argument in the beliefs of someone with which they disagreed. And so what happens in political discourse is we're talking past each other. We're not talking to each other in the same language in a certain sense, right? And that makes it hard for us to sort of sit down and understand each other, right?
Is that because liberals tend to hang out with liberals more and more, and conservatives tend to hang out with conservatives? And if you're a teacher, maybe everybody's liberal, but if you're a construction worker, maybe everybody's conservative. I learned a long time ago in reporting that the most important thing is to let people talk and to understand what they have to say. It just seems like even in our own families, someone whom we disagree with, we try to understand where they're coming from. Why do you think that way? What is there any research on what's impeding that?
Again, I think it's partially the way people process information, right? That it's hard, right? People don't want to be wrong. It's hard to change people's opinions. And so this is not an easy process, right? So again, there's been some experiments in political science working on sort of like, how do we do this? And one of the techniques that has become somewhat popular is what we call deep canvassing, right? And you can't, what that means is that you can't just go knock on someone's door and hand them a little pamphlet and say, vote yes on 2, right? Like, that's not going to change anyone's mind. What changes people's minds is doing what you say, engaging them in a conversation, listening to them, talking to them about what they're feeling and what they're believing. It's not always effective, but it's the most sort of effective thing we have. But it's hard work, right? And it's not clear to me, right? Again, going back to we say we want some things, but then our actions are very different. And, I think about this in the context of politics too, right? People say, oh, I just want, an honest, trustworthy, sort of politician. And then people go out and they say where they stand and it's how dare you, right? Like, we say we want certain things in politicians, but when those people emerge, I'm not sure if they don't agree with us, we don't have the ability to say, oh, I don't agree with you, but I respect you.
Well, sometimes I think it's even worse. If someone says something clumsily, but they have good intention, and that has some sort of racist rhetoric or homophobic rhetoric or politically incorrect rhetoric of one kind or another, it's almost like there's a gotcha impulse as opposed to well, why would you think that way? And what makes you say that?
Yeah, and I think social media, going back to that, does amplify that tendency, right? We see it on social media, right? That calling people out and doing that, leads to more likes, more retweets, whatnot. I think, and particularly, I think this is true at, college campuses. And I think the Globe ran recently, I don't know if they did a story or they're reporting a survey or they're reporting on a survey of sort of, what's really going down on college campuses. And, there's this whole idea that on college campuses that you cannot say the wrong thing and that you will get in trouble. But my colleague, Lucas Mann, wrote a really good article about this, and it was in Slate magazine. He's like, that's not what I see on my campus. And that's not what I see at all for my students, right? I, with a colleague, ran a class about diversity in higher education, and we had some really raw conversations. And nobody was like, I'm never speaking to you again, right? I think when we have those interactions face to face, they don't always go well. We can't always convince people, but we're more likely to be able to have those conversations that lead to understanding.
But
social media.
How can you have a conversation when either the media or the political consultants just want to capitalize on divisions or misunderstandings, exploit them rather than...
Because it goes back to the whole thing, right? Negative feelings about an opponent is an important driver of voting. And so, you can say, if you're a candidate, you want to be positive and, be on the high road as much as you want. It's not effective. It's not effective. And that's the real conundrum, right? Ultimately, it comes down to us. We have to stop being persuaded by that, right? I'm not super optimistic about it, right? Because that takes a lot of work. And I'm not sure people, and this is not a dig on people, right? Most people have other things going on in their life. They don't want to spend that time doing that.
Okay, we have a question from Jeannie Costa. How do you provide opposing opinions and beliefs when people on social media tend to listen to the same media outlets that fit their opinions, such as MSNBC or Fox News? So we have, unlike when I grew up and you had only 3 television stations and everybody got the same news and you either agreed with it or disagree with it. Now you can just watch Fox or even more extreme stations than Fox. You can just watch MSNBC or even more extreme media than them, and never even read or view about what people who disagree with you are thinking or are saying. Is that part of the problem?
Yeah, well, in answer to your questions, how do you do this on social media? You don't. I don't, right? I'm a big advocate of scroll on by. because I don't think social media is a particularly effective vehicle for having these conversations. But I do think we
But they
can
can
have,
drive numbers.
yeah, for sure. But if you're looking like, how do you make change, right? It's got to be one-on-one. You're not going to go out and have like the effective argument that, you know, converts all of your conservative or liberal high school friends, right? I don't think that's really how it works. And so it's got to be getting out of our bubbles, right? It's got to be engaging with you know, other people, and listening to them. And I'll say this as a plug. I really do think local government can be a good vehicle for that, right? Like, look at our committee was very intensely divided about this issue, right? But I respect every person on that committee. And we've moved on from that issue, and we continue to work with each other because we listen to each other and we respect each other. Getting involved in local organizations and local government can introduce you to people who think differently than you. And that's a good thing, right? I've volunteered in the town of Dartmouth government for a long time, more years than I would like to count. I have worked with people all across the aisle, and I will say almost down to 100%. Every single person that comes to volunteer their time for the town of Dartmouth is driven by a desire to make our community better. They may think differently about what better means for our community, but they still want to make our community better. And that, extending that grace to people, allows you to work with people and to talk to people who disagree with you vehemently, right? If you understand that. And I wish a little bit, I think, you know, there's a lot of vitriol in politics right now, but that helps me, you know, sort of sometimes find my center again, to be reminded of that people are coming from a different place than me. Right. And so when I teach in my classes, I talk to people, we all believe in the abstract pretty much in the same things. If you ask people, things like freedom and equality, right? But those things come in conflict, right? And sometimes those conflicts are irreconcilable. You value freedom, I value equality. Neither of those are a bad thing, but they're on opposing sides, right? Of policy debates. And so if I can recognize that you're fundamentally being driven by a value that I hold, but weighed differently, that can help us sort of find some common ground, I think, sometimes. And I really, to my students, try to sort of drill down into what's fundamentally driving things so we can recognize that commonality.
I want to push back just a little bit, because I think that there is commonality, and I see the value of understanding where the other person comes from. But in the final analysis, a decision is made, and sometimes a decision is made that is, all decisions are not equal, and all decisions are not fair. So I'll give the example of, well, let's get away from Dartmouth, of the Confederate monuments in the South. And for many years, recently a lot of them have come down, but for many years, African-American people, they were just told to suck it up, like, you know, that monument is staying there, even though they knew what that monument meant to them and what that continual message was meant to give to them. And they didn't have political power in those southern states. And so no matter how much they were involved in the process, they lost. And I think, I guess you can say, well, you just have to live with it. But sometimes people don't want to live with that injustice.
I don't think you have to live with it, right? I'm not saying, oh, just, you know, wipe your hands and say, oh, that's good, nothing we can do here, right? You have to continue to fight for what you believe is right. But that doesn't mean you have to hate the person that won, right? And I think we're better served if we continually try to reach across the aisle and to work together. It's not always possible, right? I mean, like, look, I'm not going to say let's reach across the aisle and, you know, make nice with Nazis, right? I mean, there are some beliefs that, you know, I think hopefully maybe this is a controversial statement to say that we shouldn't, reach across the aisle to work with Nazis. But for the most part, right, that's not what we're talking about, right? And so, you know, I think you have to continue to work towards your vision of a just society, right? And I think we've had some conversations, you and I, about, you know, personally, right? I think, you know, what is it? The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice, right? And that means you have to keep working, but you don't have to work with hate in your heart.
Absolutely, absolutely. You had sent me an article by a fellow named, I hope I pronounced his name correctly, Lee Drakeman. It was in the 538 blog about how hatred came to dominate America. And he talked about the urban-rural divide and how the nationalization of issues and how you can almost tell what someone thinks as to where they live, whether it's in a city or a rural area. But what that got me thinking was, I see that divide between New Bedford and the suburbs, and I see, you know, it on issues like education, the quality of education in the suburbs versus the quality in the city, the quality of healthcare available to some of the working people in the city versus people who are more gainfully employed in the suburbs. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that. Is that, I mean, I think that divide is right here locally with us. I don't know. It doesn't seem like just a national thing.
Yeah, although I guess, you know, for me, when I look at the South Coast in particular now, I really see us as being a really sort of rare and unique sort of thing in the US right now. And that is we're pretty purple. And increasingly what we see, right, places like Boston, Cambridge, right, blue, right, you have the Cape, red, right, and there's very little mixing. The South Coast used to be really sort of strongly Democratic, but it's much more evenly split. And so I think there are some divides, right? New Bedford versus, you know, say Dartmouth or Westport. At the same point in time, you look at election results across the cities and, you know, the towns in this region, and they're increasingly close. We're one of the very few sort of competitive regions in the state. And I always kind of joke about, you know, Charlie Baker learned that the hard way. His first run through town, he was, you know, opposed to South Coast Rail. And then he lost, and then he came through and was miraculously in support of South Coast Rail, won by 40,000 votes, right? The first time he won office. And he's delivered on South Coast Rail because he knows this is a place where he can get votes, right? And so we're a little bit unique in that I don't think we're as reliably red or blue, right? I mean, there are lots of Republicans and Democrats in Dartmouth. There's Democrats and Republicans in New Bedford.
I guess, but I guess what I was trying to get at is that I think some of these national issues that we saw manifested in the Dartmouth Indian controversy are really just reflections of things that are national debates. Yeah. But the debate on I'll give the example again, public education and healthcare. I think there are real differences between the quality of it, you know, between the city and the suburbs. But I see town meetings, and I see select boards, and I see city council, and I see the mayor, but I don't see anything back and forth as to, you know, the only regional school is the Voc Tech, and that has its own issues of bias that they've been charged with in their admissions. I don't see any discussion about, it's almost like it's not an issue, but it is an issue as to you know, are we one region or is it just we're the suburbanites and we're the urbanites?
Well, you know, and I think, you know, being a Midwesterner, right, and moving to Massachusetts, the whole sort of structure of local government here in the Commonwealth is interesting to me, right? Like, I grew up outside of Chicago. There's lots of what we would call unincorporated areas, right? That don't belong to any town, right? And so county governments play a much larger role. And there's some of that move towards consolidation. And we see that in other states, right? But Massachusetts, with our 351 towns that are all contiguous, right? Everything's in a town, right? Towns become the primary unit of government. Counties are virtually worthless in the state of Massachusetts. They're simply a redundant level of government. And so we don't have, there are disincentives towards regionalization, right? In the school district that I grew up in, it crossed, right, town borders. And so what we had two different school districts that cost multiple towns, one that was a bunch of elementary schools that cost multiple towns, and one that was a bunch of high schools that crossed multiple towns, right? And so we didn't have a superintendent for every district, right? We had two for multiple towns, high school, elementary, right? And coming here is like, what do you mean there's a superintendent in every district? That seems weird. Some of these districts are really small, right? But the state has to create those incentives, right? Like the state has to create incentives for regionalization. And I think nowhere is this more evident than on the question of housing, right?
No, absolutely. And the state has tried to address the issue of housing through the 40B law, where if you build a development, particularly in the suburbs where they tend not to meet the cap, they have to devote a certain amount to affordable housing. And in every suburb I've ever been in, they fight it hard. And there are issues of taxes and things like that, but it's not something that let me put it this way. I think the reason the state has not embraced regionalization is because the suburban legislators don't want it. But I want to move on. Correct.
Yes, absolutely. I was going to go there, but I'll let you go there. I mean, I think that's it, right?
I'm the opinion columnist. We have a question from David Aarons. So far, much of this discussion is based on observations about how similarly both liberals and conservatives operate. That is the physics of politics. However, missing here is the recognition of the fact that one party has gone off the rails and is now flirting with fascism, if not calling for it. Please address that. So do we tend to address the Republicans and Democrats as equal because we're trying to be, you're trying to be an objective political scientist, I'm trying to be an objective journalist, and the two sides are not equal?
Yeah, I mean, David's right. There is research, right, that as we talk about polarization, the parties have not polarized equally fast rates, right? The polarization has been much more pronounced and rapid on the Republican side, right? That is true, and that's a little what I was getting at, right? When we go, well, we'll get a Democratic source and we get a Republican source, right? It's hard when the parties are polarizing and moving in different directions. And, I generally speaking as an instructor in a classroom, right, try to come at this from a somewhat neutral perspective. But I think that's right. And this is the thing that we struggle with as political scientists, right? People who study American politics are deeply concerned about the state of our democracy, right? The state of our democracy, our democracy has a constitution, we have rules and laws and norms, but that system functions only so much as we buy into those rules and norms, right? And when one side is less likely to believe in those norms, right? That, for instance, that the results of an election are the results of an election, that makes it very difficult, right, to sort of engage. But it's difficult to see what the solution is.
Yeah, I mean, if you we talked earlier about trying to understand where somebody else's, the opposing side is coming from, and letting that drive the conversation rather than trying to convince with your own points of view. But if someone is denying reality, how much understanding can you provide to that?
Right. It is a challenge, right? A significant part of the Republican Party base believes that the 2020 election outcome was different than it actually was, right? There have been dozens and dozens of studies and audits, right, of these results. There is very little, if no evidence of fraud. right? And so that's right, that's where it becomes, I agree, it becomes difficult. That doesn't mean we can't try, but like, how do you engage with someone who does not believe, right? And the election outcome that was, I mean, all of the evidence, right, shows there was very little fraud, if any.
So sometimes no matter how much you try to understand where the other person is coming from, you just have to draw a line and say that, I can't broker you any equal footing here because you haven't brought me any facts.
Right. And it's a challenge, right? Really, how do you, I don't know how you address and how you fix that, right? Say you are a Democrat, right? So what's the solution? Do you continue to play by the rules? Right? Because if you do and the other team's not playing by the rules, but then if you stop playing by the rules, right, that's the death spiral of democracy. Right? And so there's some really high stakes over the next couple of elections, right? Whether our democracy holds. And these are the debates that we're having as an academic discipline now. Like, political scientists are deeply, deeply, deeply concerned about the state of our democracy, deeply. And there's some real concerns about whether or not our democracy will survive.
I mean, it almost seems like a certain segment of the population has given up on democracy. They think that democracy is not solving our problems, and I'm willing to give it up because I think this is what needs to be done for the country. And so,
yeah, I think
sometimes I think some of these election denier talking points are being put forth by people who know that they're lying, but they find it in their political interest to put forward the lie anyway. So how do you try to grant them respect when they're not acting in any kind of respectful manner?
this is the real conundrum. But how do we manage that? I guess maybe I'm fundamentally an optimist, and I think we have to engage, right? Because I'm not sure what the alternatives are, right? We can't simply walk away. We can't simply say, whatever happens, happens. And so we have to fight. We have to engage, not fight, but engage, right? To try to make this right, to try to make democracy hold. It's not clear how this, I don't have a crystal ball, how this is going to turn out, right? There are some really important, Supreme Court decisions coming up about the counting of, votes, whether or not we'll have some action in Congress about this, right? All of these things are up in the air now, and they can make a real difference.
Whether state legislatures can reverse a popular vote.
Correct.
Yeah. I have a question from Ken Hartnett. Ken Hartnett is retired editor to the Standard Times. My full disclosure, my personal mentor, both there and here at the New Bedford Light. And his question is along the same lines. How do you address polite engagement when faced with a blatant lie? Do you call it out or smile through in the interest of gentility?
I think it depends on the person. Right. For me, I will say throughout, I'll use the logo sort of debate, right? And I pick my battles, right? You're not going to convert everyone, right? But are there people that you can have conversations with and that you can talk to? And so, I did that with some people, not with everyone. I think we have to all try where we can, but recognize that, not every battle is winnable, right? Or we can't convince people, or sometimes people will be disrespectful.
Is there any chance of changing the Electoral College? It doesn't seem like the rural states find it in their interest to change it. It seems like to me like that's a big part of the loss of faith of young people in the system, because they do not. I mean, no one is really arguing for a pure democracy. That would be hard to achieve, but it's electoral college is increasingly far from a pure democracy.
Yeah, so whenever I teach this, we talk about the electoral college, and I teach my students the electoral college, and I say, how many of you want to keep the electoral college? Nobody wants to keep the electoral college. So then we launch into, well, why do we still have the electoral college? And the answer is because amending the Constitution is hard, right? It's hard. And so there is an alternative to that, though, and it's called the National Popular Vote. And there's a National Popular Vote Compact. And basically, a number, mostly liberal and democratic state legislatures have passed laws saying that when enough states have passed this bill, we pledge to give our electors to the winner of the national popular vote. So you have to get what, I can't remember what's half of 538, how many, like 271 electoral votes. So the way the law is written is that these states have said, when enough states equal to 271 electoral votes or more, that's not the right number. Someone will probably correct me. But when enough states have passed that, we all pledge to give all of our electors to the winner of the national popular vote.
But that proposal's been out there for a while, and it doesn't seem.
It's not going to pass, no, because rural states don't have sort of any desire to, right? I mean, you look at California, which has, I don't know, 20, 30 million people, right? And they have the same number of senators as Wyoming, Rhode Island, right?
But you can see it from the point of the small states. They want to have some leverage versus a pure popular vote, but they don't have leverage now. They have dominance of
absolutely
big states.
Right. Yes, but so that requires, right, even getting rid of the electoral college doesn't get rid of sort of the, when I teach my class, when I teach 101, I say our system has several undemocratic features, and the Senate really is not a particularly democratic institution. If democracy is one person, one vote, the Senate is not democratic, right? Because the votes of people in California simply count for less in the Senate than the votes of people in a state like Rhode Island.
But as a political scientist, do you see some value in some limitations on pure democracy?
Yeah, for sure. I do. Absolutely. I will maybe shock you and say I have, some agreement with the late Justice Scalia, who said, one of the most fundamental changes that we made to our Constitution that we didn't really understand was the direct election of senators. Right? We switched to a more democratic system, and we fundamentally altered the balance of power and the nature of our political system without understanding it. And I can't remember the columnist in the New York, I think it was in the New York Times, maybe the Washington Post had a column recently about reinstating the appointment of US senators as a sort of an alternative to some of our sort of political maladies. I haven't read it in great depth. I've just sort of skimmed it. But that's another sort of a move back away from democracy.
So the state legislatures would then appoint the senators?
Yeah, that's how it used to be done.
These are the same state legislatures that now are frantically writing laws to outlaw abortion from the moment of conception?
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. But, at the same point in time, it also, it puts the states, it gives the states some interest as a collective state rather than sort of focusing on, your slice of the voters. It's a complicated sort of thing, but that's another way we can sort of make some changes to our political system. I mean, honestly, I think some changes are needed, but given how sort of dramatic or how polarized we are, that's going to be really difficult.
Boy, this hour has gone by really quickly, at least for me. I could talk to you endlessly about these subjects. Before we wrap up, I would like to ask you about your research because it does intrigue me, both about the effects of political organizations and gender on state legislatures, and also the way college students learn in their level of engagement and interest in politics? Those are two big questions that you can talk for an hour on each one, but give me a little of each.
So I'll tackle the first is gender in state legislatures. Okay. And because this is, you know, somewhat controversial. Oh, should I vote for someone just because they're a woman or a person of color? Well, the research is pretty clear that, right, when you have a more diverse, right, sort of decision-making body, you get different decisions. You talk about different issues, you listen to different people, you listen to different groups, and you listen to, right, you just get sort of different outputs from legislatures when those bodies are more diverse. So, you know, that I think is an important thing to note about sort of decision-making bodies.
We still don't have a legislature in either house that is a majority of women, correct?
Nevada, I believe. It's either Nevada or Vermont, but I think Nevada.
I meant in Massachusetts.
Yeah, not here. No, we're not close. Nope. I would say with respect to sort of one of the things that political scientists are interested in, like, I'm not interested in making Democrats or making Republicans, but I am interested in getting my students to engage in politics. And that's one of the things that I really want to take away from them, to take away from my class, the importance of being engaged. There's a lot of research that suggests, oh, let's get people civically engaged. Let's have them out doing service, working in a, you know, soup kitchen, or, you know, building houses, Habitat for Humanity, that's going to get them involved in politics. But what we see, particularly among young people, is that they tend to see politics as sort of nasty, divisive, right? And they don't want to engage. And so when we have them engage in sort of service activities, they see that as an alternative to politics, and they're no less likely to engage in politics. So a lot of my research in my classes has been trying to get them to engage in service, but then making the connections between what they're seeing in their service, right, and sort of government policy. So as one example, I teach an education policy class, and we've brought the students in both over to New Bedford schools and to Dartmouth schools in different semesters, working with kids, talking to kids. And then we come back and we talk about it, right? And I can distinctly remember one of my students recounting a story about how, you know, they read a book to one of the kids in the New Bedford schools, and they said, oh, you know, well, what do you read at home? And the kid said, I don't have any books at home. And this kid, then we came back to, right, class, and we started talking about stuff. And it was this really deep engagement about, well, yeah, you can go read to kids, but look at these policies or these programs that other governments run that provide books or early learning, or, right? And so you make that connection between what they're seeing in the classroom or their engagement to policies and solutions. And that sort of work really does get students engaged in politics. They're much more likely to follow politics, to be prepared to participate. And that's sort of really important, that we can't just get them out volunteering in their communities. We have to then make explicit for them the connections to politics and policies.
Well, that's well worth doing, because it's the next generations that are going to solve all these problems that,
yeah, absolutely,
that we've left with them. Dr. Jenkins, Shannon, thank you so much for joining the New Bedford Light for this hour-long chat. It's really been enlightening. As I said, I could talk to you all night about politics. I hope you'll come back and be a supporter of the Light and talk to us on other issues too.
I will. Thanks so much for having me tonight, Jack.
Thanks very much. I don't know if Andy is coming back now or not, or we'll just wrap it up.